Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a moment that's often misunderstood, misrepresented, or simply brushed off as violent chaos. But the Boxer Rebellion wasn't just a nationalistic spasm or an anti-foreign riot, it was a profound response to a crumbling system under the weight of foreign control. Here's the truth. What exploded in China around 1900 wasn't just about killing missionaries or storming embassies. It was the boiling point of something much deeper. Centuries of decentralized, community-driven traditions were being fractured by sudden, imposed systems, economic, religious, political, dropped in from powerful foreign empires that didn't understand or respect local culture. Imagine living in a village where decisions were once guided by generations of wisdom, ritual, and regional consensus, and now, foreign banks, soldiers, and missionaries are rewriting the rules. Trade policies were dictated from abroad. Courts answered to European laws. Religion was evangelized by outsiders who came with military escorts. These weren't just inconveniences, they were existential threats to identity, autonomy, and survival. So this rebellion? It wasn't just about hating foreigners. It was about defending a way of life, defending the soul of a civilization. And that makes it much more than a footnote in a textbook. What happens when ancient systems meet modern empires? What happens when spiritual identity collides with commercial exploitation? That's the story we're about to tell. Let's begin. Before we get to the chaos of rebellion, we need to understand the house that was already on fire. By the late 1800s, the Qing Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, was teetering. On paper, it still ruled the largest population on Earth. But in reality, it was fragile, hollowed out from within and surrounded by vultures from without. Corruption was widespread. Local officials often bought their positions and then used those posts to enrich themselves rather than serve the people. Imperial edicts came from the top, but by the time they trickled down to the countryside, they were either ignored or twisted into something unrecognizable. Then came the military defeats. China had once considered itself the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization. But after humiliating losses in the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War, that illusion shattered. The empire that once saw itself as invincible had been defeated, carved up, and bullied by foreign powers. That kind of trauma doesn't stay at the borders, it ripples through the soul of a nation. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, peasants were starving, droughts hit, taxes rose, banditry increased. The rural economy, once supported by village networks and small-scale farming, was collapsing under the combined weight of natural disaster and political incompetence. And yet, the central government responded with the same approach it had always used: slow, top-down reforms that were out of touch and too little, too late. This is the China the Boxers came from, not a land of peace disturbed by fanatics, but a land already fractured and exhausted, desperately searching for meaning, strength, and someone to blame. And in that vacuum, something dangerous started to form. Now let's talk about the economic gut punch that helped drive everything over the edge. After China's defeats in the Opium Wars, it was forced to sign a series of what became known as the unequal treaties. Think of these like contracts where one side has a gun to the other's head. Treaties like the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 and the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 didn't just end wars, they opened China up like a stuck pig for imperial powers to feast on. These treaties did a few devastating things. First, they opened Chinese ports to foreign merchants, on foreign terms. This meant cheap European goods came flooding in, undercutting local artisans and producers. Imagine being a village weaver or blacksmith and watching your entire livelihood vanish because a British ship just dumped crates of machine-made goods into your local market. Domestic producers simply couldn't compete. Second, these treaties slashed tariffs. That sounds good if you're a free trader, but for China, it removed one of its few tools to protect its economy. Tariff revenue, money the state relied on to fund infrastructure, defense, even basic governance, plummeted. So the government raised taxes on peasants to make up the difference. The rich got foreign imports. The poor got tax collectors. Third, and perhaps most humiliating, were the extraterritorial rights. Foreigners in China were no longer subject to Chinese law. If a British businessman committed a crime in China, he would be tried in a British-run court, not a Chinese one. That's like someone breaking into your house, stealing your food, and then laughing because only their friends get to judge them. In short, these treaties created a two-tiered society, one where foreigners and their Chinese collaborators lived above the law and profited from the dismemberment of the economy, while ordinary citizens bore the costs. This wasn't just about trade, it was about sovereignty, about who gets to make the rules, and who gets crushed by them. And as we'll see next, that sense of humiliation wasn't limited to economics. It reached all the way into the sacred heart of Chinese culture. If the economic invasion hollowed out China's markets, the cultural invasion went after its soul. Christian missionaries didn't just show up to preach, they came backed by imperial power. Foreigners weren't just knocking on doors with Bibles in hand. They were protected by treaties, consulates, and sometimes gunboats. That protection meant they could challenge deeply rooted traditions without facing the consequences that a local Chinese would. And they did challenge them. Missionaries often dismissed Confucian rituals, ancestral worship, and local festivals as pagan or backward. In many cases, they actively tried to replace them. They set up schools, churches, and hospitals, yes, but these often operated outside of local authority, with foreign funding and foreign rules. To many villagers, this didn't feel like charity. It felt like cultural conquest. Now picture this. A rural village watches as its temples fall into disrepair while a newly built church, staffed by foreigners, shines bright at the center of town. Local customs get mocked. Ancestor veneration is called idolatry. And if a conflict breaks out, the missionary simply retreats behind foreign legal protections. This created deep resentment, not just because the missionaries were foreign, but because they were often seen as untouchable, even when they overstepped. Worse still, when Chinese converts to Christianity got into disputes with neighbors or local officials, they could appeal to foreign consuls for protection. That protection further eroded local authority and made the church look like a tool of imperial power. To the average villager, this wasn't just about religion. It was about control, about dignity, about outsiders redefining right and wrong in their own homeland. So when the rebellion broke out, it wasn't random that churches and missionaries were among the first targets. The Boxers saw them as symbols of everything that had gone wrong, not just foreign, but protected, privileged, and invasive. And the people who rose up against this? They weren't generals or politicians. They were villagers. Now let's meet the so-called Boxers. They weren't part of any government. They didn't wear uniforms. Most had never set foot in a formal school. These were peasants, farmers, martial artists, spirit mediums, people from the countryside who had been pushed to the edge economically, spiritually, and politically. They called themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. The West just called them Boxers because of their martial arts practices. But what they really were defenders of a way of life that was slipping away. They weren't centrally organized. There was no grand leader, no unified manifesto. What they had was a shared feeling, one of betrayal, humiliation, and desperation. They trained in villages, performing rituals and chanting incantations they believed would make them invulnerable to bullets. Now, to modern ears, that sounds naive. But for them, it wasn't about science. It was about faith, about power, about reclaiming control in a world where everything had been taken from them. They didn't just oppose foreign soldiers. They opposed missionaries, westernized elites, and even Qing officials who were seen as weak or complicit. To them, the decay wasn't just coming from outside. It was rotting from within. Their movement was fiery, but it wasn't mindless. The Boxers had slogans, fierce ones. Support the Qing, exterminate the foreigners. Or, in other regions, down with the Qing, destroy the foreign devils. The contradictions reflect how decentralized the movement truly was. Some Boxers wanted to save the empire by purging it. Others wanted to burn it all down and start over. But here's what united them. They were fighting for moral clarity, cultural survival, and local dignity. And when you've lost everything else, sometimes the only thing left to defend is your soul. And that's where the real tension begins. Because the empire they lived under saw a chance to use that rage for its own ends. Now here's where things get complicated. At first, the Qing court wasn't sure what to make of the Boxers. On the one hand, they were causing chaos, burning churches, attacking foreigners, and undermining order. But on the other hand, they were doing something the imperial court hadn't managed to do in decades. They were uniting people, stirring up loyalty, channeling outrage. And that caught the attention of Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi was no fool. She had survived palace intrigue, foreign humiliation, and internal rebellions. She understood power, and in the Boxers, she saw an opportunity, a grassroots movement that might be manipulated into restoring imperial legitimacy. If the Boxers could be harnessed, maybe they could drive out the foreigners and rebuild the aura of imperial strength. But that plan came with risks. The Boxers weren't soldiers. They didn't take orders. They didn't play politics. They were decentralized and unpredictable, or more like a wildfire than a weapon. Trying to use them was like riding a tiger. If you lose control, you get eaten. Still, the Qing court gave it a shot. Edicts were sent, support was offered, and eventually, the imperial army even joined the Boxers in fighting against foreign forces. It was a desperate move, an attempt to reassert control by embracing chaos, and it backfired. Foreign nations saw it as a declaration of war. The fragile line between rebellion and diplomacy snapped. The court, already unstable, found itself dragged into a war it couldn't win, fighting alongside a force it couldn't command. In the end, by trying to use the Boxers to save the dynasty, Cixi only hastened its collapse. The rebellion that started as a cry from the countryside had now become an international crisis, with 8 global powers preparing to strike back. And they weren't coming to negotiate. This is where the full weight of empire crashes down. In response to the Boxer attacks, and especially the Qing court's decision to back them, 8 of the world's most powerful nations formed a military alliance. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. That's not a minor diplomatic effort. That's a coalition of global empires, each with their own interests, uniting for a common purpose, to protect their citizens, yes, but more importantly, to protect their imperial foothold in China. They sent tens of thousands of troops, not just soldiers, but warships, artillery, engineers, supply chains. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a show of force, a performance designed to say, loud and clear, that rebellion against empire would not be tolerated. Foreign soldiers stormed through northern China. Cities were shelled, villages were raided, and despite the alliance's stated goals of restoring order, there were widespread reports of looting, civilian killings, and mass reprisals. For many Chinese civilians, the so-called saviors looked a lot like invaders. Meanwhile, political cartoons across Europe and America mocked China, drawing it as a dragon, a pig, or a child being scolded by grown-up nations. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about barbarism, reinforcing the idea that the West was justified in its intervention. The narrative wasn't just military, it was moral. It framed empire as order, and resistance as savagery. But ask yourself, if this was just about protecting diplomats, why did the response look more like a military occupation? Because what the 8-nation alliance really defended wasn't peace. It was a global system of trade, extraction, and dominance that could not afford to let one corner of the map slip out of control. The rebellion would be crushed. But at what cost? And for whose benefit? The answer comes into focus during the siege that followed. Now we reach the boiling point. For 55 tense, violent, and chaotic days, the Boxers, backed by Qing troops, laid siege to the foreign legation quarter in Beijing. Inside were diplomats, missionaries, soldiers, and civilians from multiple nations. Outside, thousands of Boxers, armed with swords, fire, and unshakable belief, surrounded them. And the Qing Imperial Army? Instead of stopping the siege, they joined in. This was no longer just a rebellion. It was an international hostage crisis in the heart of a crumbling empire. Inside the legations, people dug trenches, built makeshift barricades, and rationed food and water. Foreign marines held the line, but they were vastly outnumbered. Every night, the defenders braced for another wave. Every day, they buried the dead. Missionaries tended to the wounded. Children watched from windows, learning the rhythms of gunfire. Outside the walls, the Boxers believed they were fighting for justice, spiritual and national. They thought they were purging corruption, defending the ancestors, avenging humiliation. But to the foreigners trapped inside, it felt like a descent into hell. The Western press devoured the story. Sensational headlines painted the Boxers as bloodthirsty fanatics. Newspapers described barbaric rituals, cannibalism, and wild-eyed monks immune to bullets. Most of it was exaggerated or outright false. But the message landed: China was out of control. Civilization was under siege. This global media frenzy helped shape the legacy of the rebellion. It transformed a complex, grassroots uprising into a simple narrative: civilized West versus savage East, order versus chaos, good versus evil. But if you zoom out, it's not so simple. This wasn't just a battle. It was the moment two worldviews collided, one rooted in centuries of tradition, the other in the machinery of modern empire. And once the 8-nation alliance broke through the siege, they didn't stop at liberation. They wanted payback. The rebellion was crushed, but the punishment had only just begun. In 1901, China was forced to sign the Boxer Protocol, a treaty that wasn't about peace. It was about humiliation, control, and making an example of what happens when you challenge empire. The terms were brutal. China had to pay 450 million taels of silver. That's more than 10 years' worth of total tax revenue gone. And with interest, that sum ballooned even higher over the next 39 years. This wasn't just a fine, it was economic warfare. A generational debt meant to keep China kneeling. But it didn't stop at money. The protocol demanded that foreign troops could be stationed permanently in Beijing. That meant a foreign military presence embedded in the very heart of China's capital, watching, waiting, and reminding everyone who really held the power. Key officials were executed. Others were imprisoned or stripped of their rank. China was forbidden from importing arms for 2 years, crippling any attempt at military modernization. And while the treaty claimed to restore order, what it really did was paralyze the Qing regime and tie the country's hands for decades. Spiritually, the damage ran even deeper. Temples had been destroyed, cultural artifacts looted, people forced to watch their leaders bow before the very powers they once hoped to resist. Reforms were shelved, pride was shattered, and for many, the idea of self-determination became something distant and unreachable. This was more than defeat, it was engineered dependence. And when you crush a nation like that, when you force it to survive under the weight of debt, occupation, and shame, you don't create peace. You plant the seeds for something else, something unpredictable, and those seeds would grow fast. The Boxer Protocol didn't just end a rebellion. It rewired the system of incentives that held China together and set it on a path toward collapse. Let's break it down. First, the Qing Dynasty lost more than money. It lost legitimacy. The people had watched their rulers fail to stop the foreign invasion, then watched them sign away sovereignty under threat of more violence. That kind of humiliation doesn't disappear. It lingers. And when a government loses the trust of its people, it doesn't matter how old or powerful it once was, it begins to unravel. Second, the foreign powers didn't use their victory to stabilize or support reform. They used it to extract more land, more access to railways and mines, more special rights for their citizens. They called it peace, but in practice, it was rent-seeking, turning conquest into a cash flow. Voluntary exchange gave way to coercion. Agreements weren't negotiated, they were imposed. And what about reform? You'd think the trauma of the rebellion might push China toward change. And it did, but only in pockets. Many regional leaders, like Zhang Zhidong and Yuan Shikai, began building up their own power bases. Military, economic, and political authority started to shift away from the imperial center and into the provinces. What emerged was a kind of warlord federalism, a fractured state where local power trumped national unity. In other words, the empire didn't modernize, it fragmented, and beneath it all, the system of incentives had been completely warped. Foreign governments had no incentive to empower a strong, independent China. The Qing court had no ability to lead reform, and the people, caught between corrupt elites and foreign occupiers, were left with little hope and even less agency. This wasn't the end of history. It was a preview of the chaos to come. Let's pause here, because if we only tell this story from the top down, we miss something essential. Most boxers weren't strategists or fanatics. They were ordinary people, villagers, sons and daughters of farmers, people who had seen their land taken, their traditions mocked, their gods replaced with foreign ones. They didn't rebel because they loved violence. They rebelled because every institution that once gave them stability, economic, spiritual, political, had been undermined, and no one was coming to save them. The Western narrative often paints the boxers as irrational mobs. But what if we flipped the perspective? Imagine a foreign army rolled into your town. They told you your customs were backward, your beliefs were wrong, your leaders were corrupt, and your laws no longer applied. They took your food, burned your temples, and handed power to local collaborators. How long would it take before you fought back? That's what this was. A fight for meaning, for memory, for the right to live without foreign dictates. Even among the rebellion, there were figures who tried to build something better. Local leaders organized defenses, created communication networks, and articulated their grievances, not just in slogans, but in philosophy and prayer. This wasn't chaos. It was resistance, cultural resistance. And yet, the global empires never saw them as people. They saw them as a problem to be crushed. They labeled them terrorists, insurgents, devil worshippers, anything but human beings with hopes and reasons. This is the part of history we often erase, the part where regular people push back, not because they want power, but because they want to protect what little they still have. History is not just made by emperors and treaties. It's made by people like them. So let's ask the uncomfortable question. Who actually gained from all of this? The official narrative, especially in Western textbooks, says the intervention was about protecting lives, about peace, about stopping chaos. But when the dust settled, it wasn't the Chinese people who came out ahead. It wasn't the villages that were rebuilt, or the temples that were restored, or the markets that were revived. It was the banks, the railroads, the consulates, the trading companies. Foreign powers used the rebellion as justification to deepen their grip on China. They walked away with stronger control over customs revenues, permanent military bases, expanded territorial privileges, and more leverage over Chinese leadership. And they called it order. But let's look at the alternative. What if, instead of using missionaries and gunboats, the West had respected local customs and allowed organic trade relationships to develop? What if reform had come from within, through local experimentation and voluntary exchange, instead of being imposed through blood and indemnity? Could the rebellion have been avoided? Could lives have been saved? Could trust, between East and West, have grown rather than shattered? These aren't abstract questions, they're moral ones. Because if the answer to rebellion is always domination, then we're not solving the root causes. We're just postponing them. And if profit comes at the cost of sovereignty, then maybe the so-called civilizing mission wasn't civil at all. Maybe it was just conquest with better branding. Here's the twist in the story that few ever talk about. Before the rebellion, China wasn't blind to the need for reform. All across the country, there were scholars, merchants, and local officials experimenting with new ideas, modern education, railroads, military restructuring, even small-scale constitutionalism. And many of these efforts didn't come from the imperial court. They came from the ground up. In provinces like Hunan and Guangdong, There were governors working with local elites to modernize their regions without waiting for permission from Beijing. These were bottom-up solutions, voluntary cooperation, decentralized innovation, but those efforts were fragile. The Qing court, clinging to centralized power, often saw local reformers as threats. Foreign powers, meanwhile, preferred dealing with a weak imperial center rather than a rising network of empowered regions. And when the Boxer Rebellion erupted, both sides, Qing and foreign, cracked down on anything they couldn't control. The result? Reformers were silenced, regional experiments were abandoned, and trust between innovators and the state evaporated. The chance to modernize organically, through dialogue, trade, and adaptation, was smothered under the weight of imperial paranoia and foreign occupation. This is the part history books often skip. That change was possible, that it was already happening, and that it was crushed, not because it failed, but because it wasn't convenient for the people in charge. So instead of evolution, China got collapse. Instead of empowerment, it got control. And all because the people who claimed to bring progress couldn't tolerate progress that didn't come from them. The Boxer Rebellion wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a global pattern, a pattern you'll see again and again if you study the age of empires closely enough. In India, the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 erupted after local soldiers were forced to choose between their religion and the demands of a foreign crown. In southern Africa, the Zulu resistance rose to defend ancestral lands against British encroachment. In the Philippines, Filipino revolutionaries fought both Spanish and American domination, dreaming of a republic that never got to breathe on its own. Different places, different cultures, but the pattern is the same. Foreign powers arrive claiming to civilize, modernize, and bring peace. But in doing so, they impose systems that disregard local knowledge, dismantle traditional institutions, and concentrate power into foreign hands. When people resist, whether through protest, rebellion, or spiritual defiance, they are labeled irrational, dangerous, backward. And so, the cycle continues. Control breeds resentment, resentment sparks rebellion, rebellion justifies more control. That's the tragedy of empire. It's not just the violence, it's the illusion that domination is a path to progress. But history keeps showing us that real stability doesn't come from force. It comes from consent, from cooperation, from understanding that progress means something different in every place, and that no civilization has a monopoly on truth. The Boxers weren't alone. They were part of a global chorus, one that kept rising, even when the world refused to listen. And their legacy? It's still singing. So, what does the Boxer Rebellion really teach us? It teaches us that people don't revolt out of nowhere. They revolt when their traditions are erased, their economies are hollowed out, and their dignity is treated like a problem to be solved. They revolt when outsiders redefine their world and call it progress. The Boxer Rebellion wasn't just a failure of diplomacy or a burst of chaos. It was the natural consequence of a world system that prioritized dominance over dialogue, central power over local knowledge, and profit over people. And yet, in the cracks of that system, you could see something else. You could see glimpses of an alternative path, a China reforming on its own terms, a rural population willing to stand for something even when the odds were impossible, a population that didn't just want to fight the West, but wanted to be heard, wanted to matter. When people lose their sovereignty, economic, political, or spiritual, they will fight to get it back. And that fight may look messy, it may look desperate, but it's not meaningless. It's a warning about what happens when we forget that true power doesn't come from foreign treaties, military alliances, or imperial flags. It comes from the consent of the governed, from trust, from mutual respect. That's the truth behind history. If you found this perspective valuable, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. For those of you who want to go deeper, you can check out the podcast version of this episode using the link in the description. And if you're curious about other untold stories of empire, rebellion, and resistance, there's plenty more to explore right here on the channel. Thanks for watching.